Welcome everybody to Remote Talks. For a very exciting episode today that has been a long time in the making, given our scheduling struggles here, mostly my small kids. I'm today joined by Mackenzie and Ellen. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. Mackenzie, starting with you.
So my name is McKensie Mack. My pronouns are they them theirs, and I am an anti-oppression consultant, a researcher, facilitator, and the founder of a social justice organization based in Chicago called MMG.
Thank you, Mackenzie. And you, Ellen?
My name is Ellen Powell. I am the co-founder and CEO of a nonprofit called Project Include. We are focused on giving everyone a fair chance to succeed in tech, and we use data and convenings of startup CEOs and advocacy to promote our mission.
So I think it might be an interesting point to start. Regular listeners know that I care very much about the intersection of diversity, inclusion, and remote work. Project Include, you recently published an harassment report with that, Ellen. I have been reading that with great interest and a bit of shock, to be honest. Could you give a slight overview of like what were the findings of the report? What is it about? And I'm also very interested, obvious beyond just interest, like what got you started on something like this?
So Project Include has always been very data oriented, and when we learned during the pandemic that there were more people who were experiencing harassment and hostility during the pandemic working remotely, we decided to take a data-based approach and survey remote workers and see what we found. We ended up surveying almost 3,000 people. I want to let Mackenzie dive into the results, but it's been a very sobering look at what remote workplaces mean, and also the presence of all of these biases and problems that are in our offices and our physical workplaces and how they carried through to our remote workplaces, and in many cases were exacerbated.
Mackenzie, having seen the report, what was your response and a high level overview, high level thoughts?
I think one of the things that for us we talked about a lot as a research team is the fact that 85% of workers are experiencing increased anxiety since COVID-19. And I think starting with that, why that's so important to name at the outset is because it speaks to the ways in which all of us are impacted, right, by the global pandemic, and the ways in which sometimes we think of work as being separate from our personal life. And we think of the emotional impacts, the intellectual impacts, the mental impacts of the pandemic being something that we experience most at home. But the reality is that, of course, that impact is going to follow us into the workplace. And not only is it going to follow us as individuals, but it's had a major impact, for example, on the way that Black and Brown folks, Asian folks, other people of color, women and non-binary people, folks with disabilities, right, are being treated within these remote workplaces. So if I may, can I share some stats from the report?
Yeah, that would be amazing.
So I made some notes because I always want to be sure I don't forget. So I have some things that I want to share. First, that Black non-binary people and women are nearly 3 times as likely as non-binary people and women in general to experience race-based hostility. That trans people are nearly twice as likely to have experienced increased gender-based harassment since COVID-19. 98% of those folks who experienced increased gender-based harassment were women or non-binary folks specifically. And so, when we think about just some of these numbers, of course, because that's not an exhaustive kind of listing of our findings, but what we know from those findings is that the ways in which folks are experiencing harm and harassment in the remote workplace is increasing, versus what I think some folks might think would be the opposite, and that you're not in the office, you're not in physical space with folks. You're potentially, if you were in a physical office, now you're working remotely, so maybe there is not as much contact with people. But the opposite is true in that folks going into these remote workplaces are now experiencing even more harm than previously.
And it's honestly, shocking to read for me. It's a chill, and like the numbers are chilling in of itself. I know it's a stretch, but is there, do you have a personal theory? Do you have thoughts on like why is this? Like why is it exacerbated by remote work? What is it that changed other than, the absence of the office?
Ellen, did you want to respond to that one, or you want me to?
You can go ahead, and then I'll add on.
Okay. We're a good team. And this is a question we've been asked many times, so I'm glad because I'm prepared to answer it. My personal theory, and then would love to hear from Ellen after this, is that, well, I guess first I'll start with something that's not a personal theory. These are systemic problems, right? And systemic inequities that existed long before the pandemic. So that's not a personal theory. That's like an actionable and tangible reality, especially within tech. And my personal theory is the reason why this harm is exacerbated is because, for example, when you have an existing sort of an issue, and so if we think of systemic inequity as being water in a pot, right? And then you add the stress of a global pandemic where there are a lot of folks that are feeling powerless and feeling as if they don't have control of their environment because they really are not in control. Then what happens then is the pandemic could be, in this analogy, could be considered sort of like the fire, right? So you have the water that has already been there, and then you kind of add the heat of increased anxiety across the board for folks, regardless of their gender identity, sexuality, race. And then what eventually happens then is you get an uptick in harm, because then those folks who hold the most privilege and power within companies, right, are feeling like that sense of anxiety, and also feeling a lot of concern for the future of their companies, and potentially then exacerbate those issues of harm and harassment, because now they're creating an environment that's even more controlling and domineering. So one example of that I had heard during the pandemic is that there was a remote sort of company, and folks were actually required to check in with their managers remotely at least 3 to 4 times a day, right? And it's like, okay, well, why would you need to check in with your manager that many times in an 8-hour period? Of course, that's going to really, really raise a worker's sort of sense of anxiety within the workplace. But then also in that kind of environment, that's also going to increase the likelihood that somebody is going to be harmed or harassed, especially if it's that much sort of like control that's being sort of pushed on to workers in that environment.
I think one thing that we see a lot, for example, is that employers start to monitor their employees with software even, right? Like rather than like requiring people to check in, to install software that actively monitors employees. And you see all sorts of trends on the internet related to, I have to make sure my mouse keeps moving so that they give a false sense of presence at work. I always find that somewhat of a scary prospect. I would be very uncomfortable working in an environment where someone feels the need to constantly check on me and to look at what I'm doing, right? Like it's clearly not about my output if that's the case. And for sure that, I mean, it would raise my anxiety further than it has already in the past year. Ellen, any further thoughts on this?
I agree 100% with both of those perspectives. And I would add, I think a big part of it is also that people aren't great managers sometimes, right? If I don't trust my workers and I don't know how to manage them, then I'm going to use these surveillance tools, or I'm going to use these check-ins because I'm not confident that they're actually doing the work that I'm asking them to do. I might have too many Zoom meetings or phone calls, or I might have the keystroke checks or the mouse checks, or I might have, there are some companies that are using software that keeps the video on and that's watching you work all day. And all of these aspects are, tied to this problem that there is a lack of trust between employees and the companies and the managers that they're working at often. I think part of the reason why we're seeing increased harassment and hostility, all forms of it, gender-based, race-based, sexual orientation-based, it's because employees don't trust their companies to deal with these problems. So they don't report, they don't bring them up, they don't try to resolve them. And then, the person who's perpetuating the harm continues, and other people might be observing that it's okay and it's allowed. And sometimes, we had survey respondents say it was like their head of HR or it was their CEO who had the inappropriate comments or the inappropriate behavior. And that just fostered a culture where people, the harm doers felt comfortable doing harm, and the people who were experiencing the harm did not feel comfortable reporting it. So I think, that's a big problem. I think in this time frame also of this pandemic, we also saw, huge protests against systemic racism. We saw a lot of racism in the counter protests. We saw racism against Asians coming from the then president of the United States. We saw, all sorts of issues that, people were struggling to deal with, caused anxiety to the people from the groups being discriminated against. And it was also, a threat to the people who have enjoyed these privileges and feel entitled. And all of a sudden they're facing, people calling for change, and that change is uncomfortable. And in order to kind of try to restore the control that they want, that Mackenzie brought up, they are, they feel like they have to start, they may be more hostile, they may be more harassing. We're fostering this environment where they're allowed to do that. And they're feeling also this work pressure and anxiety from all of these additional factors.
I think one interesting thing that the report mentions, because many people will be listening to this and they'll be thinking, well, that's other organizations. That's not happening in my organization. I think one of the things that the report found was that leadership is often not aware of problems existing in their organization, or maybe getting worse through remote work or through the pandemic. What are some of the things leadership can do? The people that are listening right now and that are thinking to themselves, well, I'm not aware of these kind of problems. Where do they start after listening to this? Mackenzie, maybe you could answer this.
I think that sort of love this question. Thank you so much for asking it. And I think it's in alignment with something that Ellen just shared, where she talked about how, there are folks who are afraid, who don't trust their companies to actually do something about harm and harassment in the workplace. And I think in addition to that comment, I would add that also there are a number of leadership teams within tech who don't trust their workers to actually tell the truth about what the culture is like. And who are like, if you're coming to me with something critical or negative, it must be because something is wrong with your perception, or you just can't cut it in this environment, And I think it's one of the first sort of beginning pieces around that is our leaders actually developing processes where workers can actually speak honestly about their lived experiences. Excuse me. So one example of that is through like an equity audit, where it's a mixed methods research process that's held or organized and held and implemented by an external partner that includes both qualitative and quantitative analysis of what's happening within an organization. And that also offers, within that qualitative piece, offers workers confidentiality so that they can actually share honestly around their experiences and really talk about the ways in which they are experiencing the culture, which can happen where they're sharing experiences of harm and harassment, but it can also happen where they're sharing experiences around operations and the ways in which potentially situations from colleague to colleague that start off as conflict, but because there are no systems and no sort of education as to how to deal with conflict, then can easily become harm and harassment, if left sort of untended to. I think it's really about providing those resources, but then also creating some sort of a data-informed strategy for how culture can be evaluated over time.
And then the idea being that if you start to implement changes, you test again, you measure again, and you see how the organization progresses.
Exactly. Because what's happening right now, I think, within remote working environments, within tech specifically, is there are a lot of leaders who might hear a complaint of harassment, and the response is, okay, well, give them bystander training. Let's do bystander training across the organization. And there's nothing inherently bad about bystander training. Bystander training is really good, right? We're talking about identifying harm, stopping harm, intervening, and at the same time, right, without any sort of measurement of what the goals are, understanding of like, okay, this is great that we're doing this across the organization, we're providing these resources and tools, but like, what actually is the state of harm in our organization? What's the state of repair in our organization, our company? And then in addition to that, what kinds of systems have we put into place so that people can at any time anonymously report their experiences? And then what happens to those reports? So it's not enough just to provide the space, but then are we actually listening to what people are sharing? Are we actually evaluating that? And is sort of that anonymous sort of system, if we've created and if we have established it, is it something that actually informs our company strategy in the long term?
Ellen, I think one of the, go ahead if you want to add to that.
I would just add, and part of it is solving the root problem, which is, does your company actually value inclusion? Does it actually want people to be treated equitably? And to ensure that that's happening, a lot of times you do need training on, like here are, starting from like, we have a set of company values that includes these concepts of fairness and equity. And we have a, set of expectations, whether it's in a code of conduct or in the processes that you run that incorporate these ideas of fairness and equity and justice. And then, if there are people who don't understand it, like maybe they need to go to training. Maybe they need to understand like the history of our country, the history of our systems, and understand like this is what we're fighting against, and that we need to make sure we're not incorporating into our companies. And for a lot of companies, it means like training your leadership, training your CEO, training your board, right? It comes from the top and it works its way down. And people look to the leaders for and their behavior and their statements for direction. And if your leaders don't understand it and aren't practicing it, it's not going to happen in the rest of the organization.
Yeah, I think the report mentions at the end some recommendations, and I think this is one of them, that you, as a leader, you have to lead by example, because if you're not actually, trying to make an impact, if you don't act according to the values that you've set, then, well, how do you expect the rest of the organization to follow suit and start behaving in a very similar kind of way? Mackenzie, your company, you focus on change management, making a change within organizations. One of the things that you mentioned is that companies are struggling with employee benefits. Could you elaborate a little bit on this?
Sure. So I'll provide like an example from our report specifically, where, for example, let's say there's a tech company, and within that company specifically, there are folks that are like, okay, company leaders specifically that are saying we want to improve the ways in which our employees are experiencing the workplace. And we know that there are a lot of folks that are reported experiencing burnout. So what we're going to do is we're going to provide them with access to a mental health app, a wellness app. And that's going to be the way that we're going to solve the sort of burnout issue. And providing resources like that, again, not inherently bad, but if you're not actually, like what Ellen had sort of already brought up earlier, if you're not actually getting to the root of what's creating that burnout, it's like you're just basically putting a Band-Aid on it, right? Somebody needs surgery and you're like, okay, we're going to respond to this with a Band-Aid. And that's obviously not going to be a really effective, right, approach and response. So something that we recommended is thinking about the ways in which time off benefits are structured, as just as one example, and also requiring having sort of required minimums for people to take time off, because we know that in the society that we live in, organizational trauma, right, is very real. So even if you have a fairly decent, right, and a very sort of welcoming time off policy where people are validated and affirmed in taking time off, depending on folks' past experiences, they still just may not do it. And so it's, what about those required minimums, offering required minimums for time off, making mental health a priority in the workplace. So instead of focusing on, right, productivity, really actually focusing on the impact of what's being done, right? And not sort of pushing these arbitrary norms around. If you, for example, what you mentioned earlier, if you are moving your mouse 100 times in a day, then that means that you're a great worker, versus if you're someone that potentially moves their mouse 10 times a day, but is someone who is actually, right, putting a lot of quality into the work that they do and not focusing so much on the performance of being busy.
I think this is a recurring thing that you keep saying. I think the vacation days is very relevant. I think we hear this a lot in the tech industry, where everybody gives unlimited vacation days. It's a limited vacation days, but there's the implication there that is, well, it's unlimited, but like the reality is that if you take more vacation days, you're more likely to leave the company permanently, because we track those kind of things. When we started remote, we immediately implemented this kind of like minimal amount of days off, because exactly to prevent this. I think one of the things that we see that we struggle with is that And it goes towards, and I have to admit, I never heard the term organizational trauma, but I can understand where it comes from. I think we actually struggle to actually get people to the point of taking enough time off, because we say there's a minimum. You have, I think it's 20 days that we have now, a little bit more than that. And we'll start to see that we are several months throughout the year, and like people haven't taken their proportional amount of vacation days off. And we have to start telling them, you have to start taking vacation days off, or you will have to take the entire month of December by the end of the year. That's not the purpose of these days. You should actually be taking them off. And I think that is somewhat challenging, right? Like I think that's a very different attitude as an employer, where I think in the past it was, culturally acceptable as an employer to essentially demand that anybody's always working, and then those days off are like a gift to the employees. Whereas now I think we are, if you're a good employer, it's your duty to do the opposite, to say, look, I want to, you have to be living a life and doing well in your life to be able to do a good job. Like, and we cannot expect it to be the other way around. Any further thoughts, Ellen, on benefits for, and like how can we do better in this sense?
Yeah, I think the kind of corollary is you have to make sure that people don't feel pressure, that they're missing out on that time to do work, and that when they get back to work, they're going to be overwhelmed. So I think, one reason people might not be taking their time off is because they feel like they are underwater, and they will get even more underwater. And there's already all of this additional anxiety around the pandemic. People are working longer hours. They don't think the work will stop, and they don't think that and they think they have the same amount of work. So if I take a day off, then I have to do twice as much work that day that I come back. So giving people a sense of, a lighter workload, that during those times off, you're not actually accruing more work. You're actually given a real day off, and you have the same level of work when you return. I think that part is not happening for a lot of people. They don't feel confident, and so that day off becomes one filled with anxiety at what they're going to return to.
I think one of the coolest things I've seen recently was a company where the out of office reply was, I'm out of office, all incoming email will be deleted. And so there, like, if you need something from me, I'm available again from July 15, and you'll have to resend your email because the email will be deleted. And that makes me think about this. And I think that's actually, if you really think about it, it's kind of a reasonable thing, right? Because I think we all know exactly what you're saying. I come back to work from vacation and I have a massive email inbox. Like, do I declare email bankruptcy? Well, that's easier just to do if you're hiring an organization. But for most people, that is not at all something that you might feel comfortable doing, because, you might anger someone with that.
I'm gonna write that down. I love that.
I think it was actually a very large, I don't remember which employer, but I think it was a very large employer, like a car manufacturer of some sort, that did something like that. And yeah, I mean, I am actually very supportive of those kind of things, although I really hope that the people in, our accounts payable don't apply that strategy, because that would cause a lot of trouble. What can companies do to make benefits more inclusive? I think this is something that we haven't touched on too much yet, but I can definitely see that there's some problems. To give you my perspective, at least, on benefits, so we deal with benefits in every country in the world, and what we see is that statutory benefits are all over the place, right? In particular, if you think about, parents, for example. Maternity leave, for example, in different countries. In some countries, it is independent of the parent, whether it's the father or the mother or a caretaker, whether it is an adoption or not. In other countries, it is the mother gets maternity leave and the father has to return to work after 3 days. If you're a modern company, how should you approach this in the first place? Where do you even start? Mackenzie, I'm shooting it to you.
Okay. I was just about to ask, like, Ellen, do you want to take this? So thanks for that. So I think, something that I would like to see more from companies is being more imaginative around the ways in which they develop benefits for their staff, for their workers. I'll give an example of Patagonia in the 70s. And the idea at that time of offering people parental leave was like considered just so, forward moving, so progressive. And, I'm sure at that time by a lot of companies was considered to be something that was completely and totally unnecessary. And now we consider it to be, not in all companies, unfortunately, but in a lot of companies, we consider it to be something that is just absolutely required, right? Something that is a basic sort of necessity for benefits. So I think, for me, it's really pushing companies to think about what does it mean to be as imaginative as possible. And then also, how are you, going back to one of the earlier things that we talked about in our discussion, how are you actually listening to your workers, to your employees, and getting a better understanding of what their needs are, and then applying that to the ways in which you frame your strategy around benefits? I think for me, a big one too is being as trans inclusive as possible. So for example, there are a number of companies that when they're referring to benefits, they use terms like maternal leave. And we know that there are men who have babies, there are non-binary people who have babies and children, and also there are parents who adopt children, who foster children. So who not only have children in their lives or are caring for children based on having actually given birth to a child in their family, or having a child could be given birth to in their families. So for me, it's thinking really expansively around the ways in which people experience life, and understanding that potentially what might have been acceptable and completely reasonable right in the 90s or in the 80s is going to be completely different now. And it should, because as we evolve and grow, we should become even more considerate of the ways in which our companies and the ways in which the kind of cultural environments we're building have an impact on our society. I hope that's helpful to respond to your question.
No, I mean, I think it's an amazing response, and I think it makes total sense, right? Like I think, again, from our perspective, we see this internationally playing out very differently, right? We now see countries where it is, paternal leave in any form. It's independent of what the exact relationship is, independent of gender. It's as exactly as you would want to design these kind of things. But yeah, we see the exact opposite as well, right? Like the classic example of, well, the mother who gave birth is the one that gets time off, and that's it, and that's about it. And I think there's no reason that employers don't give better policies and set better standards, right? It's just,
Yeah.
you don't have to follow necessarily what is statutory or what the government prescribes or sets as like, this is how we set it by law. Ellen, do you have any further perspectives on this?
I agree 100% with Mackenzie and you. I would love to see companies be more innovative, and instead of taking that minimal approach of what do I need to provide, to start thinking out of the box, like to start thinking in a more a more humane way. This whole movement around workers with dignity, like what do we need to provide in order to let people lead dignified lives? The one additional point, I wish people would think about how they actually implement these policies, because we've heard from a lot of people that that they don't feel comfortable taking some of these benefits, that while the benefit has been offered, certain groups aren't allowed to take them. Like when they apply for the benefit, or when they inform their manager that they're taking leave, they're rejected from it, or others feel like they don't have the the position or the goodwill or the entitlement to take these benefits. So it would be great for people to track, like, who's actually taking these benefits and using them, and who is not, and who qualifies but hasn't. And so for your company, like, who are these people who aren't taking 20 days across the year? Do they fall into specific categories? Do they have specific functions? Are they in specific levels? Do they have one manager? Are there patterns that you can see where there's a problem that might be deeper than just, I'm not taking the benefit because I forgot about it, or because I haven't been thinking about it, but there's actually something a little bit more systemic in why they're not doing it. I wish people would look at that and think about how are we implementing it in a way that makes sure that everybody who's entitled to it actually takes it, because we're offering it for people to use.
I think that's a very interesting way to look at it. I think one of the things that we try to do is to partially make this a responsibility of their manager, right? So that you, as a manager, you are responsible not just for growing a team and coaching the people that report to you, but also making sure that they take time off, for example, that they make use of the benefits that the employer provides, because it's very helpful. And I've experienced this myself. If you have, a boss that pushes you, a manager that pushes you to take time off, to say, no, you have to take time off. It's important. And I expect you to do so. And it's part of my evaluation of you is, are you actually taking care of yourself? Are you actually making use of the benefits that you've had? And I think that this situation, I think not many people have been in, but if you are in that situation, it's really empowering, because it's not just like, there's not this inherent bad feeling of, "Oh, I'm taking time off. Oh, I'm making use of these company resources that, yes, sure, technically have been allocated to me, but in reality, I'm just taking something away without rewarding you back immediately with work." And other ways that organizations should think about, like, encouraging usage of benefits, or what should they change so that people don't feel this kind of guilt, other than maybe what I suggested?
I
Mackenzie.
mean, I think that we talked about education earlier, and I think it's recognizing that, right, I was actually literally right before this call, was on a call with three founders of a startup, of a health tech startup. And one of the things that we're talking about was how, specifically, when you're hiring folks and you're being very intentional and aware about your hiring strategies and recognizing the ways in which people are actually impacted by systemic inequities, right? So because of that, if I were looking at the demographics of an organization, based on the intersecting demographics, I probably could make a lot of assumptions about who's going to be really comfortable or confident taking time or actually using benefits as a whole, and who is like not going to be comfortable and confident doing that because of the ways in which our society has been structured around our identities. So I probably make a lot of assumptions, and many of those assumptions would be right. Maybe a few would be wrong, but many of those assumptions I think would be right. And so I think, to sort of respond to your question, I think it's important to recognize that people need not only an invitation, but the more that folks have experienced systemic inequities, and the more that folks have experienced sort of organizational trauma, the more support that they're going to need in actually taking those benefits and taking that time, which is going to mean modeling for them that the time can be taken. It's going to be modeling for them that they actually can let folks know that they are taking parental leave and don't have to worry about if they're going to come back to a job or not. It's going to be modeling the fact that people can take, for example, self-care days or mental health days. And that's something that they're not going to be punished for in the future. And I think it means explicitly saying that on a regular basis and including that in employee handbooks, including that in consistent and regular training that's being done within companies too. So it's not just that, well, we made the invitation, we put our hands up, now it's on the workers, but instead recognizing, like, no, if we are actually being innovative and being as imaginative as possible around our benefits, we have to recognize that we have to create a runway for our workers to so we can take them along with us. We're not leaving them behind, which means providing explanations and really being very clear about what our intentions are and why we're pushing to be as innovative as we can be when it comes to our benefits.
I think, sorry, go ahead, Ellen.
Oh, sorry. I think that McKinsey's suggestions will also help with a culture shift. So for many companies, like, these additional benefits are new, and there will be some workers who don't agree with them or don't value them or try to kind of shun or in some way, kind of make fun of the people who are taking them. I remember the first person that I knew who took, what was called a paternity leave at the law firm that I worked at. Like, he felt really like he didn't take the full 16 weeks. He came back early because people were not kind to him, and they said that he was, shirking his duties as a lawyer, and and that, internal, behavior from your colleagues and your coworkers can be very intimidating and prevent you from taking the benefits, even if the company is saying the right things from the leadership level.
Yeah, I think this is one of the reasons why it's so incredibly important. And again, these kind of things flow from leadership. They set the right examples, and they follow through with that, right? Because that immediately diffuses these kind of tensions, right? If leadership, like, it's not, they don't even have to um, do the same thing. But if they simply ignore these kind of problems, if they ignore these kind of attitudes within the organization, then that creates a toxic environment, really, because that is what it is, right? Like that is exactly what we don't want to have. Like being a parent is incredibly hard, independent of which of the parents you are or what the exact situation is. You should feel free to make use of those kind of benefits. I think this might be a difficult question, and I would love to hear both of your perspectives on this. We're talking a lot, of course, and taking the example of tech companies, which tend to be leading in many ways. They tend to be often, well funded. How can we get to a future in which the majority of organizations, think about these kind of things and, provide benefits truly to everybody, that are inclusive, actually do research within their organization related to harassment? How do we get to such a future? Where do we even start?
Should I go first?
Please.
Of course, I'm going to go first on this question. I'm really actually excited to hear how Ellen responds to this. But I am going to shout out organizations like Project Include, like Code 2040, like the Algorithmic Justice League. And I say that because I think one of the ways that we get to a future like this is the way that we get to, for example, better legislation within our society. And it takes a lot of mobilizing and organizing of people around these issues, and a lot of sort of educating folks who potentially might be in tech, but may not be in the sort of positions where they actually will power and authority to be able to change systems, but do have power to be able to use their voice to name the ways in which systems that are being created within these companies and within these company cultures are harmful and toxic to everybody, really. So I think it does take a lot of organizing around it. I think in addition to that, it takes companies being willing to make commitments that are tangible and actionable. So commitments that go beyond the diversity statement and we support the Black Lives Matter movement. We stand in solidarity with Asian communities, and commitments that actually are measurable, where you could look from one year to the next and see the ways in which an action that's been taken is actually making progress, or even see the ways in which it's been ineffective, which is still a very important data point. Because if we know what the kinds of things that we've done in the past, we know that they haven't worked, and we know why they haven't worked. And it puts us in a better position to be able to create systemic solutions to systemic problems that are not focused on tools, right? Because tools are not the problem here, but that are actually focused on people and systems.
I also think there's a change in just general public perception, right? The new generation of workers, they want diversity and inclusion. Benefits are one way that they measure whether a company is diverse and inclusive. And, I think that they are going to make the decision with their feet. Like they're either going to join a company or they're not going to. And that's going to put pressure on the company to incorporate better benefits, to incorporate better practices, to think about it more from the CEO level down, because our world is changing, and the next generation has a much different perspective because they're much better informed and they're more aware of all these systemic problems that we grew up. I didn't know about any of it. I grew up thinking the world was a meritocracy, and it was like a shock when I went into the workplace and I tried to process all of the things that were happening that didn't make sense, until I finally came to the realization, oh wow, this is a systemic problem. It's not an isolated incident. And I think those they will also change the cultures of our companies as they become more and more of a bigger percentage of the employee base. I also know that there are a lot of CEOs who are thinking about these issues in a deep and meaningful way, and a lot of them are struggling. To them, it's not something that they've experienced. They don't have the lived experiences, and they have to learn. But people are sharing their experiences. They're talking about the problems. We're seeing a lot of data coming through. The organizations that Mackenzie mentioned, in addition to Project Include. I think there is the data is out there, the stories are out there, and we're going to see a next generation of leaders who doesn't look like the generation that we've had for the last 30 years in tech. We're seeing more and more CEOs who are not white men, who are who are Black, who are brown, who are Asian, who are indigenous, who are women, who are non-binary, who are transgender. Like, it's a different world. And as we see more of the people who don't who don't share the old views, who are bringing in these new ideas, who are changing the way benefits look, we'll see many of them be successful, and we'll see them leading the way and having other companies follow and emulate their success because they want to be in this next generation of leaders.
I can't agree more than with that. I think that's a good point to end on as well. Mackenzie, is there anything else you would like to share, maybe about the work that you do and the company that you run?
Just I think that people can find more information at McKenzieMack.com, Mackenzie spelled with an S. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I really appreciate you inviting us on, and I appreciate the questions you asked.
Thank you. Ellen, what about yourself?
Yeah, I appreciate this conversation. If people have time, take a look at the actual report at projectinclude.org. Mackenzie is a co-author. I also want to note we had Yang Hong and Caroline Sinders as our other two co-authors, and a team of people who did a lot of great work to get some really interesting information together.
Thank you very much, both of being on. The report is an absolute. I mean, it's fascinating to read. It is very, very clear, and it's also very beautiful. It's very well made. Yeah, and thank you for the nice conversation.